The following video will concern a firearm-like device. In the United States, what I'm going to show you is not considered a firearm. Now, that should be enough for YouTube not to flag anything, but we all know that that's not how it works because it's based on a case-by-case basis. So, first thing we're going to do is the safe check. Safing something means showing it is safe overtly so you're consciously aware. So here is a flare cartridge. Actually, in this case, it's a blank firing cartridge. Because this is a signaling device, this falls into the purview of it still being not a firearm. But anyway, it's empty, as you can see, because you can see my skin behind it. There's nothing in it. Back here would be a primer. Up here would be the cork that's used in the blank firing sequence, or a cover only, and then a flare if it had a flare in it. And in the case of a blank, it actually has propellant. So it's technically ammunition because it has a primer, some propellant, and a propelled object that's not really considered a projectile. We're going to call it a dummy cartridge because once it's deactivated, it's a dummy. Now I'm going to show you the quote-unquote non-firearm. It's not a non-gun. We won't get into details on that. So let's get this done. There is nothing in it. It is a break action. It's very easy to confirm that it has nothing in it because we can do that. Now I'm going to show you the normal sequence for firing a old style flare gun that had originally a pin here to hold the barrel on. That's the hinge point. One pin here to keep the trigger in, and another pin normally that would be right in the center of that for the hammer. You break the action. You put the cartridge in to where the business end of it is pointing towards the ground so that if something happens, worst case scenario, it'll go up or down, but not hit you. If you're on a boat, having a flare hit the deck and burn a hole is still bad, but we're trying to reduce harm. Then when you close it, you deliberately aim it away from the boat and everybody else by holding it like that. Okay? This is how I was shown to do it. Then when you're ready to fire it, only when you're ready to fire it, you've done that. And then you point it up in the air before you touch a damn thing. And you pull back the hammer. And then when you want to pull the trigger, the spring inside of it, which I removed the spring and everything in here for a specific reason, it flies forward and hits the back of the cartridge, firing it. At that point, it's an inert item as long as it's fired. If it hasn't fired, you bring it back down, open the action, push up on the business end of it, wait 30 seconds, push up on the business end, rotate it slightly, drop it back in, and repeat the process because you have a weak primer strike. Now, I want to point out a couple of features about a flare gun. Taking this out. This one has all of the other parts in it except the spring for the hammer, as you can see, because it's flopping around. And as you can see, when I pull the trigger and then let go, the trigger actively forces this thing not to be able to have the firing pin come through. If I pull the trigger, it pokes out just a teeny bit. You can just barely detect it. That is a firing pin stop or a block or a notch. It's a safety notch, but it also makes it nearly but not completely drop safe. For all practical purposes, this makes it to where you'd have to break this particular gun because it's all plastic to set off the cartridge by accident, which we're going to bring up in a minute. And obviously if you pull back the hammer, this then releases it, and obviously if the spring was back there, it would throw it forward. Now some of you have already noticed that this is not doing what the new gun does. Now I'm going to show you the procedure for loading and firing it with the new button if you were using it. Break the action, put the cartridge in, point it downrange away from anything else, close it, make sure that at that point, even if it goes off, at least it won't kill anybody. Then you're supposed to aim it up in the air, then you're supposed to push the button, and it's on the left side only, so it's not ambidextrous anymore. It was originally. And then pull back the hammer, and then you can release it, and then when you pull the trigger, it'll fly forward and set it off. What if your left hand isn't working? By the way, it is right-left hand bias, but you can do it with the left hand. It's just a bigger pain in the butt than it needs to be, okay? How do you fire it one-handed? Originally, you just do, which takes a pretty good amount of torque, and then pull the trigger to set it off. Now you have to do this, use your less strong finger to pull it back, then point it up. And at that point, you point it at your friend, the deck, a sail on your sailboat, and while pulling it back, while pushing on that, it might pull back just far enough to fly forward and set off the cartridge. This is a safety feature. Take out our cartridge. You have to make it sure that you can disable the spring. I'll have a video on how to dismantle one of these later. How to get rid of the unsafe safety button. I'm going to show you 3 ways. 1, you have to use some sort of metal pin pusher. Remember these pins here, like here and here for your, for the trigger and for the barrel. This one is the hammer pin or the hammer fulcrum. Okay? And by the way, the more you do this, the more it wears it out and the harder it is to put it together again. By the way, if you drop this on the ground, you'll lose, because this is spring-loaded, part of the gun, and it becomes broken. We put our finger over this end of it to brace it. We put pressure on the center point of this, and we push it in until we've popped off that little button. It's more of a washer than a button. Inside of it is a spring. We then set these things down and have the spring and button. Carefully, because you probably popped it off and lost it on the floor. Put it all back together again. Your mileage will vary. Some restrictions apply. Good luck getting this part back in properly. It really is a pain in the rump, the way they built and designed this. There. Take the stupid button after you got the spring out and put it on there. Now, instead of it locking, you can push it over. It'll stay pushed over like a normal safety, and you can cock and fire it. Don't leave the spring in. It works perfectly fine as a repositionable safety. It still acts as a safety. You still have to push the button, but you can push it over and then cock it. You can do it with one hand. Loading procedure. Put the cartridge in. Aim it downrange. Point it up. Push the button. Now the hammer works. And then when you pull the trigger, when you have it in storage mode, push the button back in. It's the same level of intelligence to figure out what to do, but this is less frustrating. Barely. Okay, now I'm going to show you the other procedure. And yeah, I did the other procedure. I wanted to make sure you could still have a spring in there. So if somebody wanted to be pissy about it, I could say it still has a spring in it, which is what they really care about sometimes. Making this hard to put back together again is intentional. I'm going to pull this apart to show you how this works for demonstration and education purposes only. On the side of this is a little divot for another pin. The pin is attached by this little flat piece, that's why it's shaped like that, so that it'll go in and lock it in a particular position. Now, did this position make it safer? It has some wiggle room in it on purpose. I want you to notice how much wiggle room it has if I put it in place. Let's see. Yeah, they did that. What I did is I trimmed this down so it can never work as a safety because it's an unsafe safety. Now let's wrestle the thing in the core of hell itself to get the part back in there because it's a shitty design. It's not intuitive. It's really a shitty design. There. Get in there. I made it to where no matter how far it is in, it won't block it. But when it did, what it allowed you to do was pull the trigger. Excuse me. This is funny. With the trigger in place, this is drop safe so where you can't hit the thing forward and set it off. The procedure, if you couldn't get that button to move, was to point it up in the air, pull the trigger, and hit the back of the thing as hard as you can without breaking it somehow to set off the cartridge. That's why there's the wiggle room in it. Yeah, you had to defeat the safety to fire it. The idea is people will get angry, they figure it out at the last minute, keep pulling the trigger, not be able to get it to go off, and just hit the damn thing trying to make it go off, figuring there's something wrong with the gun. The instructions on it are printed on a panel that's here normally, that no one's going to read because you're holding it in your hand, fighting the damn thing, pushing on buttons. And again, making it behave like a real safety, you just put the button back on and get rid of the spring, and it's fine. It even looks normal, but unnormally, it works. And now I'm not going to put spring on it. Why? Because taking this apart to do this modification makes it to where this thing will fly off eventually. If you drop it on the ground, you lose the freaking hinge, so you can't fire it anymore. I saved the spring for the demonstration. I'm going to throw it out after this. In a panic, when you're trying to load a flare gun, because it's so desperate, you have to do this because you don't have any options anymore. You're going to load it, pull back the hammer, and fire. Now, is that piece of plastic on this side of it, the little nib that goes in, going to shear off so you can mercifully be able to fire the damn thing? I don't know. I'd like to see someone actually safety test this. You do not safety test situations where people are happily in a training room where everything's fine. You test them under stress conditions. Make a game of it. Make it to where they're running around in a maze and they have to fire off a flare. Or just fire this with a shotgun primer in it without anything in it as a test fire. That's a reasonably safe thing if everybody wears hearing protection and eyeglasses. Can you do this? Will they just break the damn hammer? Or will the hammer shear off the stupid button thing? Or will you leave the safety on it? It's still technically safety. By every standard in every state I've ever seen, this is a safety. It's not defeating the safety. It's making it ADA compliant. A person who only has one hand working can push on it without the spring, pull back, and fire the damn thing. Why wasn't this done? Yeah, I'm a little ticked off. I tried looking on the only place I know of that can make a national ruling, a lot like the ATF rulings, a national ruling that says you have to change a piece of safety equipment that they certify. And right on the side of it has a hint. Let's see if it says anything. USCG, APP, U.S. Coast Guard approved, and it says 28.12.3. That's either 2003, 2012, or 2028. Pretty sure it ain't 28. So it's 2012 or 2003. Yeah, this is still under the standard when it didn't have the damn button. If it was U.S. Coast Guard that made this rule, which is the only entity that can regulate these things, they would have put a new date and time stamp on it. This is considered a minor modification. No, it's not, because it makes it to where you can't fire it when you're freaking out trying not to die. It's a fucking signaling device. This comes out, safety increases, and you still have your, it's not a crossbolt safety, it's actually called a hammer safety. You just do that, you're fine. It's good. And if you only do it once, you can still take it apart if you have to replace parts. And then you can put in a normal hammer without that little thing. By the way, extra credit. If you happen to have an extra one of these hammers, they're dimensionally identical. You can just swap out the hammer and defeat it as well, but just remove the spring. It'll still technically not be a violation of any rules. It's not an altered safety device because you could just tell the U.S. Coast Guard, I found the button, but I didn't find the spring, so I put it together and it still works as a safety. Are you going to give me a citation? They'll give you a written warning and you go buy another one and keep it on the boat. Coast Guard says you have to have a certain number of flare guns. It's a minimum of XYZ. They don't say that you can't have a better one that doesn't have the stupid defect that you use as your primary one. And again, the U.S. Coast Guard website does not mention this shit. And its actual name, if they used it, is not a safety, because then that gets confused with other things. It's called a hammer safety. Sometimes mistakenly called a cross bolt safety. That's the term that people use when they look at them, but this is a hammer safety. And the only other entity I know of that uses a hammer safety of this type in the fucking hinge point at the fulcrum is Leonid Cobre, yada yada, a company that put out what's sometimes called the crappiest guns on the planet, which are my favorites. Really? This was your standard? So again, get rid of the spring, make a real safety. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.